Most often, when someone stands to speak, in an assembly like this one, we talk about we're thankful for the opportunity to be here. And I think sometimes it becomes just kind of a statement that we make, and we kind of assume that it's not a very sincere one. But in my lifetime, and I've mentioned this before, there's only been one period of time that I didn't attend worship services regularly, and that would be during the period of time from February of 1968 till September, when I was in the Republic of Vietnam, and there wasn't any opportunity that I was aware of to attend any type of assembly anywhere. Later I learned there were some in some of the larger areas, but I wasn't there, not able to get there. But it is a great privilege and great opportunity. I look forward to it every week. I consider all of you to be my family, and I look forward to it. My family are people you don't necessarily live with every day, but get to see all of you every week, and some of you multiple times a week, and just really thankful for that, and just thankful that we have a shared and a common interest, and hopefully, as we assemble together, that we benefit from it, as Joe suggested in his prayer that we ought to. I think that I do, just being with you. Sometimes I look at the world and kind of think the world's gone crazy. And I know when you go home, you really appreciate the fact that the quiet and serenity of it, everyone's pretty kind of on even keel. The same thing is true at church. It's a different situation. And I really treasure it. I look forward to it. And I hope that if I live many more years, have the strength and the health and the mental ability to be able to appreciate it and be able to participate in it. Preaching is also something. When I began preaching because Pat really said to me, she said, I believe you can preach. You have the ability to speak. And so she kind of encouraged me. I got involved in it and really have enjoyed it and enjoy it yet. And I hope that each time we come together that we have something to say that's beneficial. I used to try to always get lessons that kind of pinpointed something that I thought was really an urgent need. And over the years, I've kind of come to learn that everything that God says is an urgent need, so I'm not so concerned about that anymore, as just picking topics that I think will just be generally edifying and uplifting to us and hopefully informative to those who might not have obeyed the gospel, that they might choose to be obedient to it. Sometimes in preaching, we talk about things that are kind of extended thoughts about simple subjects. And this morning is one of those lessons when someone might say, well, you could have said that in 10 seconds and saved us a lot of time. But if you ever look at the parables of Jesus, the parables of Jesus are a little bit like listening to Jerry Clower. Jerry Clower tells a story, it has a punchline. But there's a lot of things that build up to that make it where it sticks in your mind so that you understand it better. Jesus did the same thing with parables. You look at the parable of the sower, it would have been easy to have just said, well, you know what you plant, you're going to get. That's it. But that's not the way he addressed it. And he looked at the various types of soil and the effect that it had and the ineffectiveness of it and why. And we're going to do that in our lesson today. We're going to talk about a person that most of us would be familiar with. Maybe all of us are familiar with, and that would be Lot. And I tried to think of some catchy title, but I really didn't have one. And so I decided that I would stick with simple and just say things we can learn from Lot. Now, a lot of things that we're talking about, you may think, well, what are we learning from this? But I'm going to tell you, there is a lot to be learned from Lot. One of the things I think about when I think about Lot is this. We have a tendency to look at people and we kind of evaluate them in the sense of saying bad, good, bad, good, bad, good. That's not 100% accurate. Someone has said there's a lot of good and bad people, there's a lot of bad and good people. Sometimes that's true. People's lives are kind of a mixed bag. I mean, you look at them and you sometimes look at the things that we do and you think, boy, that's a great thing. But then you look at the next thing that's done and you think, how could that ever have been? And Lot's kind of one of those people. And you really learn a lot from Lot about different things. And some of those you might not have thought of, and most of them you probably have. I want to kind of introduce us to Lot first by going to the 11th chapter of the book of Genesis. And almost everything that we have by way of reading will be in the book of Genesis from chapter 11 to chapter 19. There are a few exceptions to that, but for the most part, that is true. Well, what we learn about Lot in the beginning was this. He was cared for by his grandfather and later basically adopted by his uncle because of his father's death. Now, his mother's not mentioned. I don't know what happened to her. No one can because God didn't see fit to reveal it to us. But we do know that when his father died, that it made these things necessary. Now, it's interesting to read what's said. These are the generations of Terah. Terah begat Abram, which would be Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran begat Lot. And Haran died before his father Terah in the land of his nativity in Ur of the Chaldees. And Abram and Nahor took them wives. The name of Abraham's wife was Sarah, and the name of Nahor's wife Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah, and the father of Ishka. But Sarah was barren. And this, of course, is very important in the overall story that God reveals of the coming of the Christ and how it was portrayed. And Terah took Abram his son, and Lot, the son of Haran, his son's son, and Sarah, his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went forth with them from Ur of the Chaldees to go into the land of Canaan. And they came into Haran and dwelt there. And the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. So he did not go on to the land of Canaan. Neither did, in fact, Abram's brother Nahor and his family. Only Abraham and Lot proceeded on to the land of Canaan. Abraham, of course, had no child. And he had basically, and I say basically because they lived in a day very different than ours. There were no legal proceedings. But Lot, for all practical purposes, became the son of Abraham as far as the treatment that he received and the way that his life was lived and the things that would proceed from that time forward. Now, when Abraham went to the promised land, he took Lot with him. And he treated him as a son. Now, I don't believe there's any question about that. You read the first 5 verses of chapter 12. Now, the Lord had said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country, from thy kindred, from thy father's house, and the land that I will show thee, and I will make thee a great nation. And I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee, and in thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed. And that we've studied many times. So Abraham departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed out of Haran. And Abram took Sarah his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their substance that they had gathered, and the souls that they had gotten in Haran, and they went forth to go into the land of Canaan, and into the land of Canaan they came. Now, all that's kind of important because it sets a stage for something. You know, sometimes if you don't have a stage set, you don't properly appreciate what happened. And so we've kind of got the stage set. If you jump over to the 13th chapter, Lot became a very wealthy person. And he became a wealthy person because of his association with Abraham. No question. Abraham had pretty much adopted him. And he comes into this land with Abraham. Now, Abraham had taken a little side trip to Egypt, of course, and we're not going to study that. But Abraham, when he came back up out of Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him, into the south. Now, that's important to remember, into the south. Let's talk about it in the southern part of the land that he was going to possess. The southern part would be kind of where the Jordan River ends today at the sea, the Dead Sea, as we sometimes refer to it. And so Abram was very rich in cattle and in silver and gold. He was a very wealthy man. He went on his journey from the south even to Bethel, and to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Hagood. So he's kind of up from, 50 or 60 miles up into the land down to the end is what he's talking about, under the place of the altar which he had made there at the first, and there Abram called on the name of the Lord. And Lot also, notice in verse 5, Lot also, which went with Abram, had flocks and herds and tents. Now, I don't know exactly how old Lot was when they came into the land. I don't really know. I would presume he would have been a great deal younger than Abraham. Abraham was 75, and he probably was kind of a young man at the time. And over his period of time of association with Abraham, he's become very, very wealthy. Now, that's interesting to think about. And the reason it's interesting to think about is because of the decision that he made after that. You know, sometimes we talk about something. When we look back to the the miracles that Jesus performed, I think the one that probably stirs us up the most from the standpoint of becoming irate would be the 10 lepers, where Jesus healed 10 lepers. One of them came back to thank him. And everyone heard a lesson at some point that said, where were the 9? Here their whole life has been restored, and they didn't even consider it important enough to go back and thank Jesus for what was being done. You've all heard lessons of that kind. Well, kind of think about that when you look at Lot. Here's Lot. He dies an orphan, basically. He becomes an orphan, basically. His grandfather raises him, and he dies. And so the only person left that he has any connection with is his uncle, and his uncle takes him in. Not only takes him in, but makes him to be a very wealthy man. There's no question about that. You can read it for yourself. Now let's look at what happened. Well, the wealth of them was in livestock. They were men who possessed animals. And they were livestock farmers. I remember, now things have changed a great deal over the years. But I can remember when I was a small boy, the richest, wealthiest, most secure people in almost any community were always farmers. Now, of course, because of the Industrial Revolution that finally caught up with us, that kind of changed. But used to, if you saw a fella, and he was pretty wealthy in town, he probably was a farmer, most likely. Very profitable, but then the government got mixed up and it became a much different world. So I don't know if that's so much true today as it was then, but it was then. And I have a feeling as you went back in time when there were no factories at all in the days of Abraham, that the only people who were wealthy were folks who had lots of animals and lots of people to work all those animals that they had. So here you have this man, he becomes very wealthy. And in verse 6 and 7, we find that the land was not able to bear them. They weren't just kind of wealthy. They were kind of like cattle barons of the Old West. The land wasn't able to bear them, that they might dwell together. Their substance was great, so that they could not dwell together. And as a result of that, there was strife between the herdmen of Abraham's cattle and the herdmen of Lot's cattle, and the Canaanite and the Perizzite dwell with them in the land. And I suspect that what that means is that if you start having strife among yourselves, sometimes that old saying, conquer and divide, that may be why that's mentioned. I'm not certain, but it is mentioned. But the real thing that's important to us is to look at the fact of how wealthy Lot had become. Why? Well, you say he worked hard. Well, that's fine. What if he'd have worked hard and he hadn't been Abraham's basically adopted son? Where would his position have been? Probably much different. So you look at all that, and then you look at this decision that has to be made. Abraham suggested that they settled in different areas because they were going to keep having the same problem. I'm not really very familiar with sheep, know very little about them. Know a little about goats, not much. A little about cattle, not much. But the one thing I do know is that all those animals have to eat, and I do know that sheep are the ones that tend to strip the land worse than any of the rest of them. They're kind of like a horse. They just absolutely are going to strip it. So you have to have a lot of land to keep moving them from place to place. And not only that, I also know that this was a section of the world that water was very treasured. Even today, if you look at modern Israel, they don't really have a water supply except for the ocean. They get their water out of the ocean, treat it, and that's what their water supply is because they don't have much. So you had to have water. You had to have grass. Abraham realized that. And he said, if we keep staying here, we're going to keep having problems. So Abraham says to Lot, let there be no strife, I pray thee, between me and thee, and between my herdmen and thy herdmen, for we be brethren. Is not the whole land before thee? In other words, he said, just walked up to Lot and said, look out over this land. Separate yourself, I pray thee, from me. And he said, if thou go take the left hand, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, then I'll go to the left. I'll do whatever you want to do so that we can preserve peace and we not become constantly embroiled in battle with each other. And Lot, of course, lifted up his eyes and he made a decision. The decision that he made was based on what was best for him. I mean, it was. There was no question. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt. You look at it and that's exactly what you see. He didn't look up and it didn't enter his mind and say, you know what? Everything I've got because Uncle Abraham took me under his wing and saw to me when my father and my grandfather died, and everything I have I owe to him. If it weren't for him, then I wouldn't have any of it. And I would be in a position of probably, I just shudder to think where. And so here's Lot, and he looks out over this, and that never enters his mind. It said he lifted up his eyes, he beheld all the plain of Jordan, and it was well watered everywhere. And that was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, even as the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as thou goest to Zoar. In other words, it was a great, great, great place. The rest of the land, not so much. But this was a great place. Then Lot chose him all the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated themselves the one from the other. And Abraham dwelt in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelt in the cities of the plain, and pitched his tent toward Sodom. But, I have learned in my life that there are words I don't like. And but is generally one of them. I usually don't like the word but. Most of you probably don't. He looks out and he sees this land that's a great place. And it is as it's described, a great place. But in this great place, the men of Sodom were wicked and sinners before the Lord exceedingly. My father, before I was born, had two brothers. One is 10 years older than me. One is 8 years older than me. But they were in elementary school or perhaps junior high in Chicago in the 1930s into the early 40s. And, we kind of assume some things that are not true. We kind of assume that big cities one day became wicked places and that they have all kinds of problems in it, like gangs and drugs and all. We assume that. It's not true. That was in the 1930s and 40s, Chicago was that way. So my father looked, and my brothers were getting all involved in a lot of things, including gang activity and all this. And so even as elementary kids, because they kind of collect them up early, so he decided that it was not a good idea to leave them there as they went to high school. So he moved them all back to Alabama and put them on 40 acres where they could work cotton and corn, which was a good idea. I don't know what would have happened had he stayed where they were. Well, you kind of think about Lot as he views this area. I mean, do you think that it would have ever occurred to him what might have happened? Now, I don't know how much of a family he had at this time. I don't know. But I know this. I know what happened to them. So he decides he's going here. Now, two things about this choice. He looked at what was best for him. Think about what I said there. He looked at what was best for him materially. He did not consider his uncle, and he did not consider his own spiritual welfare or his family's spiritual welfare. All he thought about was, this is a great place and I can make boatloads of money. That's what he thought. Well, if you look down the line, in chapter 14, Lot had a war here. In verse 1 and 2, there were some kings who came to Sodom and Gomorrah. At that time, Sodom was a great place to live. In today's world, it's the Dead Sea, or the Salt Sea, take your pick. In that day and age, it was a place, he said, like the Garden of Eden, is what he said, as the Garden of the Lord. That's what it was before it was destroyed. It was just a great, fertile place, and everything about it was to be desired. So these kings probably said, we're going to take it because we need it. That's most likely what happened. But anyway, they come and they make war against the people of this area. And Lot's living there. Well, in the process of this war, these kings, if you go down to verse 11, they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their victuals and went their way. And they took Lot, Abram's brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. And there came one that escaped and told Abraham the Hebrew, for he dwelt in the plain of Mamre the Amorite, brother of Ishmael and brother of Aner. And these were confederate with Abraham. And when Abraham heard that his brother was taken captive, it had been, of course, his nephew, but referred to as his brother because of their relationship, and he armed his trained servants, born in his own house. If you want to know how wealthy Abraham was, this is probably one of the places that tells you more than anything else that you really need to answer that question. He was able to put together an army of 318. Now you think about that. These were men who worked for him or were his servants. These were the people that Abraham put together. And he pursued them in the day, and he divided himself against them and his servants by night and smote them and pursued them into Horah, which is on the left hand of Damascus. And he brought back all the goods and also brought again his brother Lot and his goods and the women also and the people. Now you think about that. Not only had Abraham given Lot everything he had, but now he goes and fights a war to bring him back and to rescue him from this situation that he found himself in. You know, when you think about the relationship that Abraham and Lot had, sometimes you don't really stop to think of how involved that relationship was and how important it was to them. Especially how important it was to Lot. Well, after many years, the sins of Sodom and Gomorrah, remember that we're told over there that these cities were wicked. They were very wicked. And now in chapter 18, they're kind of brought up again. And this wickedness, over a period of years, how many years I don't exactly know, the men rose up from thence and looked toward Sodom, and Abraham went with them to bring them on the way. And so here these people are going, and Lot is settled here, and the sins of Sodom and Gomorrah have become so great that God decides He's going to destroy them. He sends someone to notify Abraham of what's taking place, and that's what you're reading about here. And the Lord said, "Shall I hide from Abraham that thing which I do? Seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. For I know him, that he will command his children and his household after him, and they shall keep the way of the Lord, to do justice and judgment, that the Lord may bring upon Abraham that which he has spoken of him." And the Lord said, "Because the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great, because their sin is very grievous, I will go down now and see what they have done altogether according to the cry of it, which has come unto me, and if not, I will know." And the men turned their faces from thence and went toward Sodom, but Abraham stood yet before the Lord. What did he stand there for? Well, remember something. Abraham had given Lot a choice, and Lot had chosen this land that is in today's world, the Dead Sea, Sodom and Gomorrah at the time, very prosperous place. He's gone down there. He's been captured by some kings, taken to captivity. Abraham goes and rescues him, brings him back, reestablishes him. And now the Lord tells him He's going to destroy this city. Well, who does that mean? Well, that would mean Lot and his family, as well as the rest of the city, would be destroyed. And so what is Abraham standing before the Lord to do? Well, all of us are familiar, I think, with the story enough to know that when you look at Abraham, that he makes a plea to God, and he starts out saying, if there are 50 righteous people, you're going to destroy it. And God said no. And he keeps narrowing that down until finally comes down, if there's 10 righteous people, you destroy it. The Lord says no, but they couldn't find 10 righteous people in the city. And so they went on their way to destroy it. But it's interesting to notice that we get to chapter 19, verse 1 through 3. There came 2 angels to Sodom and even. Lot sat in the gate of Sodom. Now, to all of us, this is not a very significant thing necessarily. I mean, you may look at it and you may think, well, this is just something that's stated in passing, but it's really not. You have to remember that in ancient cities, they, like our cities, had a lot of things that had to be done. There was banking to be done, and there was legal work to be done. There were titles, there were things that were divisive between people and issues that had to be settled. And the way that was done, they didn't have, as we do, a courthouse and all that. So everybody just, the most prominent men in the community would sit in the gate of the city. So if you need to make a loan, he was there. If you need to settle a legal dispute, he was there. And all these things were done. So Lot not only had prospered, boy, he was right up there at the top, and he was right in there with the rest of them. And he's out there at the gate of the city. Now, if you don't understand what I'm talking about, go back and read the book of Ruth and look at Boaz when he has matters to settle where he goes and how it's handled, and you'll understand what I'm saying. So here's Lot. He's become so prosperous, so respected in the city, that he's in the gate. He's one of the men. He's one of the men. And Lot, seeing them, rose up to meet them, but he also knew something about the city, and he bowed himself with his face to the ground, and he said, behold, now my lords, turn in, I pray you, into your servant's house, and tarry all night. Wash your feet, and you shall rise up early and go on your way. And they said, nay, but we will abide in the street. And he pressed them greatly. And they turned in unto him, and entered into his house, and he made them a feast, and did bake unleavened bread, and they did eat. Now, it's not stated that he did this for their protection, but from what we read in the next few verses, we kind of understand that probably was true. So you kind of see something in this. It's actually stated, if you go over to the book of 2 Peter chapter 2, and you read a little bit about this, and God refers to it. Here's Lot. He's been living in this city for a number of years. How many? I don't know. Lots of them. Long enough that he's become even more wealthy and more powerful politically and financially. And yet, we read this in 2 Peter 2 and verse 7, that the Lord delivered just Lot. Now, the just means that he was just in God's sight. And this man Lot vexed with the filthy conversation of the wicked. Let me ask you a question, if you're a Christian and you value your faith. When you look around a lot of the things you see in the world today, I mean, just if you were alive in the days that Roe versus Wade was passed, where abortion became the law of the land to any point in pregnancy, even to the point of a minute or second before birth, and that's what it's been pushed to, does that bother you? The fact that the Supreme Court in our lifetime, just a few short time ago, made a decision that men can marry men, women can marry women, that bother you? I expect it does. I expect you understand what it means when he said he vexed his righteous soul. I mean, it probably does upset you. You look at that and you think, I never thought it would reach that point, but it has. So here's Lot. And he's vexing his soul with a filthy conversation of the wicked. You look around you and you see the drug problem we have in our country. It doesn't bother you? Sure it does. So you kind of understand what he's saying. The Lord knoweth how to deliver, in verse 8 he goes on to say, for the righteous man dwelling among them, in seeing and hearing, vexed his righteous soul from day to day with their unlawful deeds. Now what I'll tell you about Lot. You know what it tells me about Lot is that even though he didn't make the best of decisions and where he went, and didn't use the right criteria for making those decisions, he had fared pretty well. He was still, as far as God calls him, a righteous man. So I don't have any reason to call him anything other than that. That's what God called him in 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 7 and 8. But you know, there's something about decisions sometimes that people also need to realize and understand. You know, decisions that we make, sometimes I've had people to argue with me and say, well, I'm not hurting anybody but myself. Well, that's really not true. No man is an island, we hear sometimes, and the fact is that everything that we do has effect on a lot of folks. So we kind of have to stop and think about a lesson we learned a lot. One is that when we make bad decisions, they affect a whole lot of people, not just us. But there's something that's happened in this period of time. There's something that's happened. And what's happened is that Lot himself has fared pretty well. And he's still a righteous man, and even though he's among all this every day, he hasn't really gotten the best of him. But that's not true of his family. Let's go back and let's read a little bit. If you go back to the 19th chapter, you begin reading in verse 12, it says that these men, these angels, ask him a question. Ask Lot, hast thou any besides? Now, of course, if they were God's servants, they knew, but a lot of times God asks questions to get us to respond. Sons-in-law, and thy sons and thy daughters, whatsoever thou hast in the city, bring them out of this place. He said, now you've got other folks, you've got daughters. Doesn't mention his sons, mentions sons and says sons-in-law and thy sons and thy daughters, which some people suspect actually means that he had all daughters and that they had sons. And I don't know if that's true or not, but some language experts state that that's true. But either way, sons-in-laws, daughters, maybe grandchildren, they're not really mentioned, so I don't know. But it's interesting that he says, you know, you need to try to get them out of this place because they're going to be destroyed. This city is going to be destroyed, and the only way that they can avoid that is they're going to have to leave. He'll destroy this place, was the cry of it. So Lot went out and spake unto his sons-in-law, which married his daughters, and so in this case it kind of suggests only daughters. And he said, get out of this place, for the Lord will destroy it. But he seemed as one that mocked unto his sons-in-law. And, of course, his daughters aren't mentioned, primarily because of the day in which they lived and who made the decision, most likely. But just think about it for a moment. I want you to put yourself in his place for a moment. Let's suppose that your daughter is married to someone, and I don't know, grandchildren aren't mentioned, but let's suppose they got a house full of grandchildren. And somebody's already lit a fuse under the dynamite, and it's burning, and when it reaches a certain point, the house is going to explode. And you're going in and saying, get out, get out, get out, and they're just laughing and saying, big whoopie-doo, I don't care. How you would feel. That's where Lot found himself. You know, sometimes you kind of go back and you think about what Galatians 6 says in verse 9. Whatsoever man soweth, that shall he also reap. Here's Lot. He made a really bad decision many years ago. Now that decision is becoming a real thing to him. A real thing to him. That's kind of interesting. That even as they were leaving the city, even his wife, you look and he tells them that they should not look back. But in verse 26, his wife looked back from behind and she became a pillar of salt. So when Lot got out of this city that he went to as a wealthy man and became extremely wealthy while he was there, extremely prominent individual, when he gets out of the city, he's living in a cave with only 2 of his younger daughters. Now that's pretty, kind of shakes you down to your boots a little bit, doesn't it? Think about that situation. But the interesting thing is that even his daughters, and something that all of us could repeat, verse 30 and 32, they're living up there in the cave. One of the things at that time that was thought to be horrible is to be childless. And the firstborn says, our Father is old, and there's not a man in all the earth come into us after the manner of all the earth. Come, let us make our Father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve seed of our Father. I want to tell you something that's interesting to me. We live in a country today when one state of the union, California, has actually passed a law that says that pedophilia is all right, because if you're no more than, I believe it says 20 years difference between your age, so that means, or 10 years, I'm sorry. If you're 21, you're having a relationship with a boy or a girl that's 11, then that's all right. We kind of reached that point. But in our country, I don't know of any state, nor any judge, nor any politician that's ever offered a law that said there's nothing perverted about having a sexual relationship with your children. Never heard it. I think it's something like it's repeated over in 1 Corinthians 5 when it says such a thing is not even so much as named among the Gentiles. That's one thing in our nation at least, and any nation that has any connection with God seems to have rejected, but they reached that point. Think of the decision that his daughters made. Why do you think they did it? Well, there's an old saying, people used to use it about frog legs. Said you can take a frog and you can put him in a pan of cool water, and you can set him on a stove, and you can turn the heat on, and he'll sit in there and die. And he will. But if you turn the water on and you get it boiling, and you pitch him in there, he'll hop out. He will. We do become accustomed to things. It's what really worries me about our country and about our world today, is how every generation becomes accustomed to things so that we view them very differently if we're not very careful. And it's something that ought to be kind of frightening to us to stop and consider. I guess if you were to ask me what's the title of the lesson beyond things we can learn from Lot, I'd say decisions have consequences, and they do. And what we do affects our lives in a lot of ways. And really the story of Lot is just such a great illustration of it. It's just such a great illustration. I don't know of what all specific lessons that we might learn. We might have a whole week or a month or 2 years of applications. But the general principles that you study there are really just kind of striking. I hope that you've kind of enjoyed the lesson a little bit. Hopefully you've kind of profited from it, that it kind of reminds you some things. Now, it's not new. I understand that. As I've said before, when I was a young preacher, I used to think I always had to preach something new, and I soon discovered that was never possible. Every time I think I came up with a great new lesson that nobody had ever preached, I'd go to a meeting and hear somebody preach the same thing. So I realized I wasn't as smart as I thought I was. So I finally learned I'm not as smart as I think I might have thought I was. I'm pretty dumb. So just kind of stick with what we know to be so. Compared to God, our wisdom is very lacking. So we just kind of look to God and repeat His wisdom. And as was told to Peter, said by Peter, that he would always remind folks, and it was said by Paul to Timothy, that's what you're to do. Don't worry about the new. Just try to make sure that you make people aware and keep them aware of the truth. Decisions have consequences. There's some great lessons in that. You need to obey the gospel. We've not preached the first principle sermon, but when you have the decision put before you, whether to repent and be baptized or not, 3,000 people gladly received the word and did repent and be baptized on the day of Pentecost, and the rest did not. We make the decision, and God gives it and puts it in our place. What decision do we make? Think about it together. We stand as we sing.